to start by pointing out, when you think about a commodity, globally traded commodity, you think about liquidity, you think about the possibility of trading in the futures market. I don't know how much you might know of it. But obviously, when we talk about price discovery, which is the price of coffee, say, in New York, you would think, well, one of the most obvious things you know is how much of anything that it needs a price, how much of there is there. So we should think how much coffee there is. Well, let me tell you, we have a problem here because we actually don't know how much coffee there is being produced every year. What I mean is this. These are the crop estimates for the last coffee years, 13, 14, and 14, 15. And here you have the main big trade houses in the world, Volcafe, Neumann Cafe Group, also the USDA, my own organization, the International Coffee Organization. And what is really striking is the range in those estimates, because what you see, for instance, for 13, 14, the lowest being my own organization's estimate, just over 145 million bags. Volcafe had over 155 million bags. That is a 10 million bag difference, or roughly 8% of total production. And the truth is, nobody knows for sure how much coffee was produced. So one of the most important elements in determining price of any product is knowing how much there is. Well, the truth is, we don't know. And that obviously means that is a fertile ground for speculation. Because if you don't know how much of it or anything, it is much more difficult to have a transparent and truly functional market. So this is just a little bit to set the situation of where we are. So if you don't know how much coffee there is, what do we know? Well, luckily, there are a few things we actually do know. One thing we do know is exports. And exports have been growing really fast. In fact, if you look at the chart here, 2014 was the total absolute peak in exports. Why is that? And why is this important? Well, first, why? Over the last 2 previous years, we had a very good Brazilian crop. By that I mean coffee years. Those two very, very abundant crops in Brazil meant that Brazil was able to gather very good surpluses. And those surpluses were put into stocks and were used and were shipped over the past 2 years, benefiting from rather good international prices and the devaluation of the local currency, of the real, which meant it was much more interesting as an exporter to sell abroad. So those exports were really high. Now, if you look at the last 3 months, they've actually come down, and they have gone back to levels that we used to see up until 2012. But what this means, and why this is important, is that these very high exports means that Brazil, and no really other producing country these days has stocks anymore. Brazil has pretty much shipped a large chunk of its stocks. So what it means is that today, we are in a much more vulnerable spot if we were to have a climatic event like we had last year. Some of you might remember that for the first 3 months of last year in Brazil, we experienced the most severe drought since we have records, particularly Minas Gerais. So, I mean, once again, we don't know exactly how much, but some people say that up to 30% of the crop was damaged. That wasn't really felt in a very severe way by the market. Yes, prices went up, no doubt, but we never felt that the supply chain was being profoundly disrupted. And that was thanks to those stocks. Brazil was able to continue shipping coffee because the coffee was there. It had been accumulated from the previous year crops. Well, those stocks are gone. Not completely, of course, but we no longer have that nice cushion we enjoyed up until recently. No other producing country, certainly in the Arabica, has any more those stocks. And what this means is that if we were to suffer any of those supply shocks in any of the top 5 producers now, we would be in a very different scenario. And we would have most likely a price hike that would be extreme and very, very fast. So what we're talking here is very high price volatility. And volatility is, of course, a constant in general of the commodities markets, simply because you cannot control the supply of coffee or sugar in the same way you control the supply of washing machines. Of course, it depends on so many things that you cannot control. But volatility has been in the rise, and it has been recently at the level of 15%, which makes life very difficult for everyone, but particularly for producers. There's many reasons why we have this price volatility, but no doubt is the diminution in stocks. And I wanted to show you this kind of long-term graph, and you can see how global stocks have actually been decreasing ever since we live in a free market. Some of you might know that up until 1989, the market was a regulated one. We had quotas, so countries could only export up to a certain amount of coffee. Ever since, it's been a free market. So I put together here a little graph showing you world stocks, which have come down, then up again, then down again, but they are certainly way below the 80 million bags that we used to have when the free market started, and they are now closer to just over 40, and the ICO composite indicator price. That composite is not really used anymore by trade, but it gives us a good indication because it combines the four what we call types of origins, that is Colombian miles, other miles, Brazilian naturals, and Robustas. So what you see here is the evolution in prices. Obviously, first, market goes down, market becomes free, prices go down. Then we have the mini frost, or not so mini frost in Brazil, and then, of course, Vietnam. Vietnam enters the market, and it supplies a huge amount of coffee, and it takes a very long time to recover. It's a very slow recovery. What happens here? Colombia. The market finally incorporates that Colombia's crop has been reduced by probably 40%. Then it starts coming down again. This is a combination of a strong dollar and a recovery. And of course, here we see Brazil, the drought. So volatility is in the increase. And one of the reasons why this is happening, and one of the worries I have, is this concentration of production. Because really, what we're seeing here is that only 2 countries are being truly successful in producing coffee. And those are, of course, Brazil and Vietnam. Together, they represent more than 50% of world production. And really, they are the only ones that have developed a kind of agro-industry that is truly profitable. Everyone else is struggling, really struggling. And by that I include Colombia, the 3rd biggest producer, a country I know very well because that's where I come from. And Colombia, yes, of course, there's lots of news now. Production has rebounded to pre-crisis levels. It's all very nice. We're back to 12, 13 million bags. Well, actually, the situation is far from good. Colombia is in crisis, and the rebound in coffee production was possible thanks to a large subsidy that the government paid. And the government was able to pay that because it had money from oil. Oil has come down, as you know, dramatically. The subsidy is no longer there, and we don't know really how it's going to be in the future because the subsidy is gone. At current prices in the C contract is no longer viable. So Colombia is struggling just like everyone else. What you see as the international coffee price, really, the C contract in New York and life in London, really only is set by Brazil and Vietnam. And everyone else has to try to adjust. And to understand why this is happening, to understand why we have this huge gap between the 2 top producers, successful, expanding, really, of course, with their own problems, but 2 very different coffee cultures, coffee histories, coffee systems. One is a very newcomer, the other one, of course, has a very long history in coffee, yet both are the 2 success phases on a global, obviously, kind of picture for coffee, is productivity. This is the key item here because who talks of productivity talks of profitability. And look at this. This is Vietnam's productivity. Of course, it's Robusta. We all know Robusta has a higher productivity. That goes without saying. But let's say it's closer to 2,500 kilograms per hectare. Let's look at Brazil. Once again, this is very much an average, so it compares both Conilon and Arabica. But let's look what happens when we go just after that. And everyone else, immediately, you see a huge decrease in productivity. Let's look at just, once again, Colombia or India, which are actually, they are far, far below Brazil. And as long as we maintain these very low productivities in coffee-producing countries, we don't stand a chance for those countries to really be successful players in the international coffee market. And the key here, to be able to turn around this, to be able to make the transition from a survival economy to a successful economy, is the transformation of the small coffee farmer into a small entrepreneur. If you ask me, what is the biggest challenge and what really do we need to think about how to change, what is the game changer here, is this change from the small farmer that thinks and acts like a small entrepreneur. Of course, this is very easier said than done, but this is the challenge, and this is the one that I will refer towards the end of my presentation on why, what can we do. Now, who has been the worst affected? we know it's Africa. Africa had roughly 18% of the market at the beginning of the free market in 1989. In fact, it has shrunk to 12% and shrinking. And for all the talk about the rebound of the African coffee sector and for all the events, and next year we have the World Coffee Conference in Africa, and for all the energy that I see when I travel and when I talk to African coffee producers, I still don't see how and really when is it going to kick back. Because it's coming from a situation of having been abandoned, the coffee farmer in Africa, when the national coffee boards were dismantled in the 90s, when liberalization started becoming the supreme and only ideology. Yes, it removed layers of bureaucracy and corruption, no doubt, but it also removed the support network, the extensionist services of the agronomist, of the scientist, and the research center. All that went away with it. And the African coffee farmer has been left, for the most, without guidance, without support. And it shows. It shows very clearly the consequences of that. So it's a very difficult situation. It's not going to be easy to turn around. And this relates to what my predecessor, Niels, was saying about what's happening to exportable production. Because many of these countries are seeing really shrinking their production. We have many cases. We know what happened to Cote d'Ivoire. We know what's happening to Kenya. You see even countries with top qualities like Kenya, and yet production keeps on decreasing. Competition from other crops, urbanization. We have many of these. So really, if we don't manage to understand the challenge, and we don't put into place the kind of long-term, really structural changes, we are going to face a situation where many of these small farmers are going to go extinct. And we are going to have a much more difficult time in having the kind of diverse and really complex world supply of coffee that we would like to see, because they are just no longer viable. And I'm not talking here in 100 years. This could happen within the next 20 or 30 years. Apart from the obviously moral problem, the social impact of losing the livelihoods of 26 million farmers around the world, but apart from that is, of course, the problem for consumption. Because here, at the Specialty Coffee Association of Europe and the one in America, of course, and we are going to celebrate the first International Coffee Day on the 1st of October under the motto quality, diversity, and passion. All those are very much the kind of characteristics of those small coffee farmers that produce the coffees we love, the coffees we like to drink, the coffees that gives us that superb quality and superb characteristics to be considered specialty. Now, the situation in consumption has changed and is changing dramatically. It is also much more complex, and in a way, it has gone the other way around from production. Whereas production has kept on concentrating, actually consumption has become much more interesting. It used to be a very neat divide where you have traditional markets, pretty much North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and I guess Argentina here, although it's not a very big consumer, and then pretty much exporting countries, obviously all the tropical and subtropical countries that can produce coffee, and emerging markets. Well, in fact, what we have now is a very interesting shift in consumption. And what we have is, whereas in 1965, 73% were those traditional markets, they are now 54%. And this year, actually, now that is going to be half. Exactly half of consumption is now traditional, and the other half is going to be what we call exporting countries, so countries that produce and consume coffee. The best example is Brazil, of course. Brazil is the second biggest consumer in the world. And Indonesia is a very good example. I went there last year, and I was struck by the passion for quality coffee, for drinking quality coffee that I witnessed. And it's not just Jakarta. I went to Banda Aceh, where we had the tsunami 10 years ago, and I found fantastic micro-roasters that were really, really proud of their own coffee and fantastic quality. So these countries, some people say coffee consumption is growing at 20% in Indonesia. 20%. Once again, we don't have reliable statistics. They themselves don't have them. But in any case, it's a really phenomenal growth. And that means exportable production is shrinking. It's shrinking, and if we don't make sure that we have the kind of coffees that we want in the quantities and qualities we want, we are going to be in trouble, just as we want to foster consumption and as we see our markets expanding. Look at this. This is just to give you an idea of the growth rates. This is the way. So traditional markets that were stagnant pretty much until very recently, they've actually started to pick up. And they've been energized by the single serve, by changes in demographics, certainly in North America, by coffee being once again seen as a cool beverage, to the whole rise of the barista, of course. Many things have happened to transform our industry. But the growth here, the one that is reeling, is of course in exporting countries and emerging countries. In many of these cases, what's happening is disposable income. The real trigger for consumption in all these emerging markets is disposable income. How much money do I have to spend in a few things more that I want? And that has risen tremendously over the past few years. And even with disturbances and the problems we are seeing in some of these new emerging economies, still, once you adopt a habit of coffee consumption, pretty much you tend to keep it. And that aided by the fact of all the new discoveries on coffee and health, and coffee from, as you know very well, being perceived as the evil twin of cigarette up until maybe the 80s, now is obviously all of a sudden we have all these new health benefits for coffee. I personally don't think we should go too much along that route because it's about more the pleasure of consumption, but it's nice to know that it might be good for you. So what we're seeing here is a situation where we have to think about, am I going to have the coffee I want to have as a roaster, as a trader in the future? Because what we're seeing is a growth rate in consumption. A very conservative growth is 1.5%. A more standard rate of growth is 2.5%. Either way, we are going to need a lot more coffee in 10 years' time, 30, 40, 50 million bags more than today. And here the question is, how do I want to do it? And you've heard a lot, I hear a lot, the word sustainability, the sustainability of the coffee industry. We say it so much that it's become meaningless. But I want to leave you with just a bit of a question here that exemplifies how difficult it is to think in a good way. What is more sustainable? The Brazilian model that has increased production, pretty much double production in 20 years without increasing planted area? And how it has done it? Obviously, using technology, industrialization, mechanization, heavy use of fertilizers, pesticides, no shade, monoculture, or the kind of bird-friendly, shade-grown, often organic that we see in Central America, in Peru, but that often has come at the expense of chopping down primary forest and expanding planted area. Not easy, but I leave it with you. Thank you.